Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. The used bookstore on Pine Street always carried a scent all its own, the smell of paper that had passed through many rainy seasons, the darkened wood of shelves baked deep by sunlight, and the faint trace of coffee drifting from the drip machine near the checkout counter. Claire Bennett had been coming there as a kind of self-rescue ritual since college. Whenever life grew too loud, she sought refuge in silent pages. That day she stood in the classics aisle with a book she knew perfectly well she would never finish. Her fingers turned a few pages while her eyes wandered, as if searching for something else without a name. At the same time, across the aisle, a man was rotating a book in his hands as though turning over a question. He wore a dark jacket, his hair slightly wind-tossed, and looked decidedly out of place in the buying a gift for mom section, just as he would later admit. He glanced up at the aisle signs as if the bookstore were a city and he were lost inside his own thoughts. Claire stepped closer to the shelf and reached for a book on the middle tier, and her fingers brushed another hand. The touch was barely there, but it was enough to make her look up. His eyes were the kind that made people slow down for a beat. Deep brown, warm, with something in them that seemed to ask the world for permission to be gentle. He pulled his hand back quickly, almost awkwardly. "Sorry," he said, his voice low as if unwilling to disturb the quiet of the books. "I think I was stealing your book." Claire shook her head. "No, I just grabbed the wrong one." He looked at the book, then at her, then back at the book, as if weighing a choice that had nothing to do with literature. "I'm looking for something my mom would like, but I think I wandered into a section that's a bit too philosophical." It was an ordinary sentence, but the way he said it made Claire let out a soft laugh, the laugh of someone who had forgotten she still could. "Then you're in the wrong aisle," she said. "The mom would like this shelves are usually closer to the counter, near the cookbooks and things that make you believe life is always tidy." He smiled too. Not broadly, just one corner of his mouth lifting, like a small lamp flicking on. "So, would you save me?" Claire should have said no. She was not someone who liked stepping into other people's lives. But that day somehow she nodded. They walked along the shelves as if inside a film where the soundtrack had been replaced by the sound of turning pages. His name was Evan. He taught history at a nearby high school. He spoke about the past with a strange sense of vitality, as if history were not ash, but embers still warm beneath the dust. Claire told him she worked at a small gallery and was continuing her literature studies in a roundabout way because life rarely followed straight lines. Evan listened without interrupting, without correcting her words, just looking at her as though he were carefully storing each sentence in a hidden drawer, afraid of dropping it. When they reached the register, Evan held the book he had chosen, then paused as if remembering something important. "If I thank you with a cup of coffee, would that be too forward?" Claire looked out through the glass door. Seattle lay gray like an unfinished piece of music. Wind pulled thin threads of rain across the street. She thought about going home early, about her small room, about the repeating sameness of her days, and she heard herself say, "No." That no was not a refusal. It was a door. Their love did not erupt. It grew naturally, like noticing the season has changed when the tree outside your window has one new leaf. Evan was not the kind of man who did grand things to prove himself. He did small things, so steadily they became safety. He remembered that Claire liked chamomile tea when she worked late. He always brought home a small loaf of bread when he passed the bakery, a habit so you won't forget to eat. He left notes on the fridge, not sentimental declarations, but simple lines like, "You tried today." They married in less than a year, in a small ceremony beneath strings of yellow lights and bunches of wildflowers. No stage, no fireworks, just hugs warm enough to stand in for everything else. In the early years, they lived in a rental apartment so small that if Claire opened the closet too hard, the door would hit the chair. Money was always just enough. Some months, not even that. But Evan always had a way of keeping not enough from becoming pain. "We're not poor," he once said when Claire stared anxiously at the bills. "We're just at the beginning." Like a good book, the first chapter is always crowded, but it opens up. And then Daisy arrived. The day Claire gave birth, Evan stood by the hospital bed, his hands trembling uncontrollably. When Daisy cried for the first time, Evan cried too, tears falling straight down, unashamed, like a man who knew he had just been given something impossibly large. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered, resting his forehead against Claire's. "Thank you for bringing the world here." Daisy grew up on Evan's bedtime stories, kings and queens, warriors and dragons. But in the end, every story came home to a roof and someone returning. Claire believed in forever the way she believed in the sun. Today might be rainy, but it was still there. Then came an ordinary Sunday, the kind of ordinary that makes people careless. That morning, Claire was still half asleep. Daisy was curled in the blankets like a small pastry. Evan pulled on his jacket, went into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and looked around. "I'm going to buy some bread," he said lightly as always. "Do you want anything special?" Claire rubbed her eyes. "Just you." Evan smiled. He bent down and kissed her forehead. The kiss was quick, warm, like a familiar punctuation mark. "I'll be right back." The door closed. Evan's footsteps went down the stairs. Then silence. Not long after, not long enough for you to be ready, the knock came. It was not a neighbor's knock, not a delivery knock. It was the kind of knock that carries the weight of bad news. Claire stepped out, hair messy, pajama top still crooked. When she opened the door, 2 police officers stood there. Their faces were the kind trained to speak cruel truths in the gentlest possible voice. Claire heard them speak, but the sound passed through water. She watched their lips move, saw the police caps, the eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers, and understood before the final sentence ended. Evan was not coming back. She did not scream. She did not fall. She stood still, as if gravity had been drained from her, then instinctively turned back into the room and lifted Daisy, pressing her child to her chest like the only proof that she was still real. Daisy, half asleep, rubbed her face against her mother's shoulder. "Mom, what's wrong?" Claire opened her mouth. No sound came out. In that moment, she knew she had stepped into another life, one where "I'll be right back" was no longer a promise. Night fell. The house still held everything: the sofa, the dining table, the painting on the wall, and Evan's shoes by the closet. But one thing was gone, and its absence rendered everything else meaningless. His breathing, a small sound no one ever notices until it disappears. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside her. The space was no wider than before, but it was deeper, so deep she felt that if she leaned in to look, she might fall. And then she understood something brutally, unmistakably true. There are losses that need no sound to make you deaf. The days that followed passed like a scratch film reel. The images kept playing, the sound still existed, but everything was warped, no longer aligned with reality. Claire remembered the scent of flowers in the funeral home, a sweetness so heavy it made her throat tighten. She remembered footsteps on the wooden floor, the sound of chairs being pulled out and pushed back in, the way people said "stay strong" in phrases they didn't even know how to place properly. But what she remembered most was her mother-in-law Pat's hand. Pat Bennett didn't hold Claire in a clinging, desperate way. She simply held her hand, held it very tightly, as if letting go would cause Claire to slip out of this world entirely. Pat's fingers were cold, but her grip was warm, a warmth that didn't come from overflowing emotion, but from sheer will. "You're still here. You're not allowed to dissolve." At the funeral, Pat stood beside Claire like a pillar. George, her father-in-law, stayed a few steps behind, quietly present. He didn't say much, didn't offer advice. He was simply there at exactly the right moments, handing her a bottle of water when she forgot to drink, pulling out a chair when she stood too long, placing a tissue in her hand before the tears had time to fall. George's silence wasn't cold. It was the silence of a man restraining himself so that someone else's pain wouldn't become heavier. Nora, Evan's sister, did everything Claire couldn't bring herself to touch. Nora signed the paperwork. Nora made the calls to the funeral home. Nora replied to messages from people whose names Claire didn't have the strength to look at. Nora arranged Daisy's pickup times, bought groceries, reminded Claire to change her clothes, and reminded her to breathe. Her sister-in-law moved back and forth like someone holding the house upright, and every time Claire looked at Nora, she saw something both redemptive and cruel. Evan was gone, but his family was still here. At night, after everyone had left, Claire sat alone in the living room, staring at Evan's jacket hanging on the hook like a mistake left behind by life itself. She didn't dare take it down. She didn't dare touch it, because the moment she did, she was afraid she would have to accept that he would never wear it again. On the third day, Claire stood in front of the mirror and looked at a woman with a familiar face and unfamiliar eyes. Somehow, in just a few days, she had aged in a way no mirror could measure. But Daisy still had to eat breakfast. Daisy still had to go to school. Daisy still needed her hair brushed and her shoelaces tied. And so Claire learned how to live in survival mode. She opened her eyes each morning, not because she wanted to, but because her daughter needed her. She brushed her teeth mechanically. She cooked breakfast with hands that functioned while her heart stood still. She practiced saying "Mom's here" in a normal enough voice so Daisy wouldn't panic. Small tasks became life rafts. She clung to them because if she let go, she had no idea where she would fall. Money quickly became a kind of reality that didn't allow grief to linger. Rent was still due. Bills were still waiting. The gallery where Claire worked called to ask when she might return. No one pressured her, but life itself had a way of forcing people upright with its quiet coldness. One morning, Claire put on her coat, walked Daisy to school, then stood in front of the gallery door as if it were a strange threshold. Inside, the familiar smell of oil paint and polished wood lingered. Lights shone down on the paintings as if illuminating other worlds. Worlds where people could still love, still lose, still keep living. Claire walked in. She greeted her coworkers. She organized files. She answered emails. She stood, watching visitors view the artwork, and nodded when needed. Everything ran terrifyingly smoothly, as if her body had taught itself how to play a living person remarkably well. But it was only when night fell that the emptiness truly spoke. Daisy slept in her room, hugging the stuffed bear Evan had once bought her, a gift that now felt like a sharp reminder. The house was so quiet that Claire could hear the refrigerator cycling on and off, the pipes trembling faintly, the wind brushing against the windows. She lay on the bed, the empty space beside her like a cliff. She reached her hand toward it, touched nothing. Yet the sense of loss came back like a reverse touch, cold and real. Some nights she sat up, opened her phone, and looked at photos of Evan. Looking into his eyes in those pictures, she felt as if she had been left behind on the edge of a world he had already crossed into. She wanted to talk to him, to ask where he had gone, to blame him, to beg, to do anything at all, as long as time could turn back. But no one answered. Once, Daisy woke in the middle of the night and stepped into the hallway in her star-printed pajamas. She stood at her mother's bedroom door, her voice small and hoarse with sleep. "Mom, I'm scared that one day I'll forget what Dad's face looks like." The words weren't loud, but they hit Claire like a punch. Claire pulled her daughter into her arms, feeling that small body tremble. Not from cold, but from fear of losing something again, from fear of losing even the memory. And in that moment, Claire understood. She could collapse, she could break, she could lose her way, but Daisy was not allowed to grow up in the darkness of forgetting. That night, after Daisy fell back asleep, Claire sat down at the kitchen table. She took out a blank notebook, a pen, and began to write. Not to move on, not to turn pain into art. She wrote as if she were framing a man, every detail, every habit, every sentence, every look, so her daughter would not be blind in memory. "Your dad liked to buy warm bread," she wrote in the first line, her hands shaking, but her letters still neat. "And your dad always kissed Mom's forehead before he left." Claire paused for a breath, inhaled, then kept writing. As if she wrote enough, Evan wouldn't disappear completely. As if memory, at the very least, could still be held in ink. The first Sunday after the funeral, Claire thought she wouldn't be able to step across Pat's threshold. Not because the house was far, but because it was too close to a life Evan had once belonged to. Every step, every door sound, every trace of old wood in the hallway felt like a question. Are you brave enough to see him in everything? Pat opened the door while Claire was still standing frozen on the porch, her hand gripping Daisy's bag strap like a lifeline. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't say, "Stay strong." Pat simply looked at Claire for a long moment, then opened her arms. Claire stepped inside, and strangely enough, she didn't collapse. The house didn't cave in. There was no explosion, no drama, just a dining table already set, a pot of soup still warm, and an empty chair where Evan used to sit. George stood in the kitchen, his back a little more stooped than before. He nodded at Claire, a greeting discreet enough that she didn't have to answer with a forced smile. Nora came running down the stairs, hugged Claire quickly, then let go, like she was afraid holding on too long might break her. Daisy ran in ahead of them, her small shoes tapping against the floor. She slowed when she saw the family photo hanging on the wall. Evan standing in the middle, one hand resting on Claire's shoulder, smiling like a man who truly believed life would be kind in the end. Daisy looked at the photo, then turned to Pat, her voice so matter-of-fact it hurt the adults in the room. "Grandma, where is my dad?" The room went still for a beat. Pat set a bowl on the table, her hand pausing for just a moment, but she didn't look away. She pulled out a chair for Daisy and sat down at her eye level. "Your dad," Pat said slowly, "it's in the stories about him, and in you." Daisy frowned. "But I don't remember his face very well. I remember how his jacket smelled." And Claire felt her throat tighten as if someone had squeezed it shut. She wanted to say she felt the same, but the words got stuck behind her teeth. George placed a spoon in front of Daisy. Nora blinked rapidly, as if blinking hard enough might keep the tears from spilling. Lunch began with ordinary motions: ladling soup, passing bread, pouring water. But what kept them sitting together wasn't the food, it was Evan. As if by an unspoken habit, stories about him began to surface, tentative at first, then gradually flowing into a stream. Nora told the story of the time Evan burned cookies at 16 and tried to hide it by dusting powdered sugar on top, as if sugar could cover the smell of smoke. George told of little Evan, afraid of thunder, sneaking into his parents' room but pretending, "I'm just getting a drink of water." Pat told of Evan's graduation day, how he held his diploma but turned back to find his mother before looking for his friends, eyes red, mouth stubborn. "I did it." Each story was like a small candle. It didn't light up the room, but it made the darkness less absolute. Claire listened, her heart softening and aching at the same time. Because when they spoke, Evan came back, not in flesh, but in outline. And that outline was beautiful enough to hurt. Daisy sat quietly, both hands around her bowl, eyes moving around the table. She swallowed every story the way she swallowed her food, slowly, seriously, as if afraid to miss even a crumb of memory. Then she asked, sharp as a pin, "Did my dad know I would grow up?" No one answered right away. Pat reached out and gently touched Daisy's head, as if smoothing a thought from her forehead. "He knew," she said. "If he were still here, he'd tell you 1,000 times." Daisy looked down. After a moment, she lifted her head again. "Then, can he see me?" The question pulled Claire straight down into a deep place. She wanted to hold her daughter, wanted to say Evan always saw her, but she was afraid of lying, afraid the truth would break Daisy. George spoke very softly, like a man who had lived too long with helplessness. "Your dad will always be in you, Daisy, even if you can't see him." Daisy nodded, as if accepting a truth she didn't fully understand yet. Then she turned to Claire. "Mom, tell me about Dad." Claire looked at her daughter, looked into those clear eyes, eyes that were Daisy's and yet frighteningly like Evan's. And Claire understood that there are responsibilities no one teaches you how to carry. Life simply drops them into your hands. "Your dad," Claire began, her voice cracking, "your dad liked warm bread, and he always cut the crispiest crust for Mom, because he said I liked the crack sound." Daisy smiled very slightly, a small smile like a signal. "I can still smile when we talk about Dad," but the smile faded quickly. She asked again, "Why did Dad leave?" Claire stiffened. Because there is no answer that makes that question less cruel. Pat placed her hand over Claire's wrist beneath the table, a small, perfectly timed touch reminding her she wasn't alone. There are things that don't have reasons, Claire said, each word like stepping on glass. But your dad loves you. That part is true. Daisy looked at her mother for a long time, then said something that made Claire go numb with pain. I'm scared I'll forget. Claire pulled her close, feeling Daisy's small shoulders tense as she tried not to cry. And Claire realized, memory is medicine, because it lets us feel the loss still here. But memory is also a blade, cutting exactly where we haven't healed. The Sundays after that became a new rhythm. Every Sunday, Claire and Daisy went to Pat's house. Not to heal, as people like to say, but to keep Evan alive in the only way left. Through stories, through presence, through an empty chair no one dared to move. Time didn't make Claire hurt less. It only changed the shape of the pain. From a direct blow, it became a low, buried ache, sometimes seeming gone until an old song played, or she saw a man standing at a bakery choosing bread, and it woke again. One rainy night, Claire came home late after a Sunday lunch. Daisy had fallen asleep in the back seat, a few strands of hair stuck to her cheek. Claire carried her inside, tucked her into bed, and looked at her peaceful face as if the world had no cracks at all. Then she went into the bedroom. The empty space beside the bed was still there. No one lay in it. No one warmed it. Rain tapped against the window like patient fingers. Claire stood still, staring at that space for so long her eyes burned. And in the silence, a question surfaced. Not to be answered, but to remind her she was still alive and still afraid. How long can I live like this? 3 years had passed since the Sunday morning Evan went out to buy bread and never came back. 3 years, a span long enough that people stopped asking, "Are you okay now?" Long enough for condolence flowers to fade from memory. Long enough for Claire to learn how to stand straight in front of the mirror without shaking, but not long enough for the emptiness in the house to become normal. It had only become familiar. Claire still worked at the gallery. She knew the exhibition schedule by heart, the smell of oil paint, the rhythm of speaking to clients in a calm, measured voice. She knew how to smile at the right moment, nod at the right beat, and say thank you like a reflex. People looked at her and saw a steady woman, raising her child well, holding a stable job, not collapsing under the weight of life. Only Claire knew that this steadiness was built from very cold bricks. Discipline, constant busyness, and a silent agreement with herself that she would not step into anything that might disturb Evan's memory. Daisy was 8 years old now, taller than before, her hair longer, and her eyes, those eyes looked so much like Evan's that sometimes Claire had to turn away, afraid of being seen through. Daisy no longer asked, "Where is Dad?" every day like she used to. Instead, she asked less often, but more deeply, like needles finding the softest place. What color did Dad like? Was Dad afraid of anything? If Dad were still alive, would he take me to the beach? Questions that made Claire feel both grateful, because her daughter still remembered, and terrified, because she remembered through absence. And something new had appeared over those 3 years. Moments when Claire realized she could still feel lighter. Something Daisy said, a beautiful painting at the gallery, a random love song on the radio that made her heart stir without pain. Each time it happened, guilt snapped her back instantly, like an invisible hand pressing on the back of her neck. Are you forgetting him? Tessa chose exactly the right afternoon, one with no significance, not an anniversary, not a death date, not a birthday, not any kind of marker, as if she knew Claire would fracture if the timing carried the scent of memory. Seattle rain fell softly. It blurred the glass, smearing streetlights into tired yellow halos. Daisy was doing her homework at the dining table. Claire brewed tea in the kitchen, her movements precise like someone who had practiced for too long to let her hands betray her. The doorbell rang. Tessa stepped inside with a paper bag and eyes that had already prepared what they needed to say. She didn't speak right away. She ate dinner with them, asked Daisy about school, listened as Daisy read a paragraph aloud, and praised her writing. Tessa smiled at the right moments, but Claire noticed a careful restraint in that smile, like someone standing at the threshold of a sensitive room. When Daisy went to her bedroom, the apartment sank into a deeper layer of silence. The sound of rain against the window suddenly became louder. Tessa set her cup down and looked directly at Claire. "It's been 3 years, Claire." Claire didn't answer. She hated it when people used numbers like keys to unlock her heart by force. "I'm not saying this to pressure you," Tessa continued, her voice gentler. "I just want to ask you something. Have you ever thought about trying to date again?" The question dropped into the kitchen like a heavy object. Claire froze, her hand still holding the dish towel, as if any movement might cause her to shatter. "Date," Claire repeated, her voice rough. "You say that like Evan is just a piece of the past that can be put away." Tessa immediately shook her head. "No, that's not it." "Then what is it?" Claire shot back, not loud but sharp. "That I should find someone else to fill the space? That I should replace him?" Tessa inhaled like someone who had just brushed against a live wire. "No one can replace Evan, and I don't want you to fill anything." She looked at Claire for a long moment. "I'm just afraid you're punishing yourself for still being alive." Claire turned away. That sentence hurt more than she wanted to admit, because it touched the exact truth she kept hidden. She had spent 3 years living as a guard at the gate of memory, letting no one in, not letting herself out. Claire's phone vibrated. A message from Nora appeared, like a hand placed down very gently. "Have you gotten home yet? Come over for lunch this Sunday. Mom's making your favorite, and if you want to talk, I'm here." Claire read it, her chest tightening. Pat and Nora had never pushed her to move on. They simply stood quietly behind her, like a safety net. If Claire fell, they would catch her. If Claire stepped forward, they wouldn't tug at her sleeve. Just then, Daisy's bedroom door cracked open. The child peeked out, hair still damp, eyes looking at her mother and Tessa as if she could read something in the air. "Mom," Daisy said softly, not asking directly about dating, but going straight to the center. "Is Mom allowed to be happy again?" Claire went still, not because the question was unexpected, but because it was exactly the question she had been asking herself for 3 years without daring to say it out loud. She knelt to Daisy's eye level, smoothing her hair. "Why do you ask that?" Daisy bit her lip. "Because I see Mom smile sometimes and then Mom stops. Like Mom's afraid that if Mom smiles, Dad will be sad." Claire's heart clenched. She realized she had unintentionally taught her daughter a cruel lesson, that joy required permission from the dead. "No," Claire said, her voice breaking but firm. "Dad wouldn't be sad because Mom is happy." Daisy looked at her for a moment, then nodded very slightly, as if setting a stone down from her chest. She went back into her room and closed the door, leaving Claire and Tessa in the quiet space that followed. Tessa spoke softly, as if afraid of damaging something fragile that had just emerged. "You see, the scariest thing isn't another man, it's your own smile." Claire closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw a strange image, herself smiling for real, not forced, not out of politeness, not for Daisy, but because life had touched her gently. And immediately after came the guilt, familiar as an old coat. "Are you leaving Evan behind?" Claire opened her eyes and looked out the window. The rain was still falling. The city was still lit. For 3 years she had believed she was simply enduring. But now a small part of her began to wonder, am I allowed to truly live? "Let me think about it," Claire said, as if speaking to Tessa, but also to herself. That night, Claire lay down and couldn't sleep, not because of the rain, not because memory was clawing at her heart, but because in her chest something that had been silent for 3 years had stirred. A small sprout, frightening, fragile, and somehow making her want to breathe more deeply. Hope. The night Claire agreed to meet Ryan, she spoke to Tessa like someone signing a contract she hadn't read. "Just dinner," she said, "just to see if I still know how to talk to a stranger." But once the phone screen went dark, the apartment suddenly became too quiet, not peaceful and quiet, the kind of silence that feels stretched tight, like a cord waiting to snap. The date arrived faster than Claire expected. That afternoon, she stood in front of her wide-open closet, staring at the neatly hung dresses like different versions of herself from different years. One from when she was Evan's wife, one from the early years of motherhood, one from the days when being presentable enough for work was all that was required. Her hand reached for a dark blue dress, simple, soft, like an answer that didn't need to make noise. But when she lifted it from the hanger, her hand trembled. Not the kind of trembling from cold, the kind that comes from a very delicate fear, the fear that if she took one more step forward, she wouldn't be able to return to the old place in her heart. The fear that something new might change the meaning of what came before. Daisy sat on the bed, hugging a pillow, watching her mother from behind. She was old enough now not to ask, "Where are you going?" in an innocent voice anymore. She asked like someone who knew there would be sadness inside the answer. "Mom, are you going out to eat with a friend?" Daisy asked, her eyes fixed on the dress in Claire's hands. Claire took a slow breath. "Yeah, just dinner." Daisy was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You look pretty." The simple words touched Claire in exactly the tender place. She turned to look at her daughter. Daisy wasn't smiling brightly. She looked very serious, like someone forcing herself to be strong. "You'll stay with Grandma," Claire said, checking again, as if certainty in the schedule could calm her racing heart. "Remember to eat dinner, brush your teeth, and—" "I know," Daisy cut in, her voice gentle but firm. Then she looked straight into her mother's eyes. "Go." "I'm okay." An 8-year-old's version of okay always makes adults feel smaller. Claire stepped forward and hugged her. Daisy's shampoo smelled clean, and in that moment Claire missed Evan with painful clarity, missed the way he used to kiss the top of Daisy's head and say their daughter was the most beautiful thing in the world. The memory surged, hot and sharp. Claire let Daisy go and forced a smile. "I'll be home early." Daisy nodded. Then, as if she wanted to say something important but was afraid of hurting her mother, she spoke very softly. "Mom, stop punishing yourself." Claire froze. The words followed her all the way to the car. The restaurant Tessa chose was small, with warm yellow lights, wooden tables and chairs, and background music just loud enough that no one could hear someone else's sigh. Not too fancy, not too crowded, a place designed for conversation without making people feel like they were performing. Claire arrived 5 minutes early, exactly the kind of woman who had grown used to being on time, to preparing for everything, as if punctuality could keep emotions from ambushing her. She sat down, set her bag on the chair, and folded her hands together beneath the table. When she saw Ryan walk in, she recognized him immediately, not because he stood out, but because he carried the look of a decent man. Ryan was of average height, with dark hair and calm eyes. He wore a simple jacket, nothing showy. As he approached the table, he slowed, as if afraid of startling her, then smiled. "Claire?" he asked, his voice warm but not intrusive. "Yes." She stood to shake his hand, aware that her palm was slightly damp. Ryan pulled out her chair, a small gesture, but Claire felt a sudden sting in her chest. Evan had done the same thing on their first date. She immediately pressed the feeling down, like hitting a mute button. The conversation began with safe topics: work, the weather, and the food. Ryan worked at a publishing house, reading manuscripts, editing sentences. He talked about books like someone who lived inside words but without showing off. He asked Claire about the gallery, not politely but genuinely. "What do you like most about the paintings?" Claire answered, and for the first few minutes, she felt okay. She even felt comfortable talking about color, about light, about the feeling of standing before a piece that makes you want to stay silent. Then Ryan asked naturally without any edge to it, "How long have you been in Seattle?" "Almost 10 years, Claire said. And then, out of old habit, the next sentence slipped out of her mouth. "I came here because my husband, Evan, got a teaching job at a school." She stopped mid-sentence as she just realized she had pushed open a door she hadn't meant to touch. Ryan didn't react strongly. He simply nodded, his gaze softening. "Evan was a history teacher." Claire pressed her lips together. "Yes." She tried to change the subject, asking Ryan what genres he liked and which cities he preferred. Ryan answered, then asked again about the gallery. But every question that brushed against Claire's life seemed to summon Evan by reflex. Claire talked about her first exhibition. Evan brought flowers, about the time she was short on money. Evan encouraged her. About Daisy, Evan had chosen her name because he wanted something light like spring. It wasn't that Claire wanted to do this. She knew she was ruining the dinner. But Evan's memory inside her wasn't a still object. It was alive, and it found its way out when Claire tried to become someone new. Ryan listened politely without interrupting. But Claire began to notice something clearly. Every time she said Evan's name, the air at the table shifted slightly, as if a third person had just taken a seat, unseen, but heavy. Ryan asked, "How old is Daisy now?" 8, Claire answered, then almost immediately added, unable to stop herself. "Evan used to say she'd be a writer. She stopped. This time not because she realized it too late, but because she suddenly heard herself as if from a distance. She heard the way she spoke of Evan, as if he were still part of the present, still at home, still waiting for her, still sitting at the head of the table, smiling as she talked. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. There was no blame, no irritation, just a very calm truth in his eyes, a truth that sent a chill down Claire's spine. She tried to smile, tried to say something light to pull everything back into the present, but her lips wouldn't cooperate. In that moment, Claire understood the most frightening thing about this date wasn't whether Ryan liked her or not. It was this. She was talking about Evan as if he were still there, and Claire didn't know whether she was trying to date again or trying to prove to her memories that she hadn't left. The moment Claire realized she was talking about Evan as if he were still sitting there, the air at the dinner table immediately became dense. No one had done anything wrong. There was no rude remark, no judging look. It was simply that the truth had begun to take shape between the two glasses of water, a truth Claire had tried to hide for years. Evan was not just a memory. To her, he was still the present. Ryan remained polite. He still nodded. He still asked a few follow-up questions, like a decent man who didn't want to hurt anyone. But Claire began to notice the small signs that only appear when someone is retreating through silence. Longer pauses before answering, eye contact that touched and then slipped away, a smile that stayed on his lips but no longer reached his eyes. Occasionally he glanced at his watch, not in a rushed way, but as if quietly wondering whether he had the right to leave. Claire tried to pull herself back. She talked about the gallery, about a new painting that had just gone up, about colors. She asked Ryan about the book he was reading. She tried to smile at the right moments, but every effort felt like placing a small bandage over a deep crack. The harder she tried to cover it, the more visible it became. Ryan responded patiently. He talked about his editing work, about how sometimes the best sentence is the one you're forced to cut so the story can survive. He said it calmly, but to Claire it sounded like a cruel metaphor. She swallowed, the feeling in her chest stretching tight, like a string about to snap. When dessert arrived, Claire tried to change direction completely. "Do you go to the beach often?" she asked, clinging to an innocent topic. Ryan smiled. "Yes, I go quite a bit. I like standing there and watching the water for a long time because water doesn't ask you to explain yourself." Claire nodded, and then, suddenly, uncontrollably, she blurted out, "Evan liked the ocean too." His name landed on the table like a heavy object. Claire froze. She felt her face heat up, not from simple embarrassment, but from something deeper, exposure. She looked at Ryan, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to save her from herself. But Ryan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, not sharp, but clear, like a door closing. "Claire," he said, I need to be honest." She gripped the edge of her napkin under the table, as if holding on to something that was falling. "Go ahead," she said, even though she already knew. Ryan looked at her. There was no pity in his eyes, only the respect of someone who didn't want to play the villain. "You're an incredible woman," he said slowly. "I could feel that from the beginning, but I can also feel that Evan is still here." Claire exhaled, the breath breaking somewhere in her throat. Ryan continued, "And that's not wrong. I didn't come here to compete with a memory. I just don't think you're ready to have someone else sitting at this table yet. Not right now." I'm sorry, Claire blurted out reflexively. I didn't mean to. Ryan shook his head. Don't apologize. You haven't done anything shameful. Grief doesn't have a schedule, and neither does love. That sentence should have made Claire feel lighter. Instead, it hurt more, because it was too kind. So kind that she had nowhere to place her anger, only a place to feel like she had failed. Ryan set his napkin down carefully, as if afraid of disturbing the fragile thing suspended between them. He took out his wallet, placed some money under the plate, and stood up. I think I should go, he said. Thank you for coming. I truly hope you find peace. Claire sat motionless. She wanted to reach out. Not because she loved Ryan, but because she couldn't bear the feeling of being left behind again, in a room with warm lights and soft music that still carried the unmistakable scent of departure. Ryan, she called, but the sound died at the tip of her tongue. He paused for a second and turned back. His eyes seemed to want to say something more, a word of comfort, a wish, another apology. But instead he simply nodded once, lightly, like ending a chapter without dragging the pain out any further, and walked away. The restaurant door closed behind him. Claire sat alone, staring at the untouched dessert like a quiet mockery. Her wineglass was almost full. On the table, the money Ryan had left sat there, not like paying for dinner, but like a cold punctuation mark. This evening was over. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She didn't cry right away. She just sat there, forcing her face to remain neutral in front of the people around her, like a woman who had practiced for too long the lesson of don't inconvenience anyone with your pain. But inside, she was collapsing. She had tried to keep living. She had tried to step out of the locked room she had stayed in for 3 years. And in a single dinner, she was reminded. She couldn't even take one step forward without dragging Evan along with her. Even in trying to move on. I failed, Claire thought, and the feeling was humiliating in a very quiet way, like being abandoned in the middle of your own effort. She signaled for the server, her voice hoarse. The check, please. She just wanted to go home. Back to Daisy. Back to the one place where she didn't have to play the role of doing okay in front of strangers. But the young server didn't bring the bill right away. She leaned in and spoke softly, as if afraid of startling Claire. Don't rush to leave, she whispered. Someone came here for you. Claire looked up, her heart clenched in a reflex of panic, as if the worst possible thing had just happened, and she turned toward the restaurant entrance. Claire turned toward the restaurant entrance with an instinctive surge of fear. In her mind, the worst possibilities flared at once. Something had happened to Daisy. Nora couldn't get through. There was an accident, a hospital. Her body slipped into a state of readiness, as if it might shatter at any second. But the person who stepped inside did not bring panic. She brought a calm that seemed to lower the volume of the entire room. Pat Bennett stood in the doorway. She wore a long, dark coat, her silver hair neatly brushed, her posture straight. The posture of someone who had walked through ruin without ever granting it the power to bend her. The restaurant's yellow light fell across her cheekbones, highlighting the lines of a woman who had lived far more than she ever spoke of. When Pat's eyes met Claire's, she didn't look around for a table. She didn't exchange pleasantries with the staff. She walked straight toward Claire, as if she knew exactly where Claire was sitting. As if on a night like this, Claire could never disappear from her sight. Claire sprang to her feet, the chair scraping back with a short sound. Her throat tightened first with embarrassment at being caught in her most fragile moment, then surprise, and then something softer, warmer, the feeling of being found. Pat, Claire said hoarsely, why are you... Pat reached out and lightly touched Claire's wrist. A brief touch, but enough to keep Claire from feeling like she was drifting. Nora called me, Pat said. Her voice held no accusation, no pressing questions, just a simple statement, setting things in their proper place. Are you okay? Claire wanted to say, I'm okay. An old reflex, a mask she had worn for 3 years. But tonight, after Ryan had left and the silence he left behind felt like a slap, Claire no longer had the strength to lie. She only shook her head very slightly. Pat looked down at the table, at the untouched dessert, at the nearly full glass, at the bill Ryan had left beneath the plate like a closing line. She didn't comment. She didn't need to. She had seen enough. Come take a walk with me, Pat said. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just walk. Claire picked up her bag. She nodded like a child being led across a dark street by an adult. They stepped outside the restaurant. The night air was cold and clean, rain clinging faintly to their hair. Seattle looked unusually bright tonight, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement in long, golden streaks. The distant hum of cars, water running along the curb, everything sounded sharper when no one was speaking. Pat didn't take Claire straight home. She led her a few blocks away to a small nearby park. There was a bench beneath a tree where the light didn't hit directly, just enough to see each other's outlines without being exposed. Pat sat down first. Claire sat beside her, clutching her bag as if it were the thing keeping her upright. For a long time, Pat said nothing. She looked up at the sky, where thin clouds drifted across the moon like a sheer veil. Claire looked too, as if staring long enough might produce an answer. Finally, Pat spoke. No preamble, no preparation. When I was your age, Pat said, I lost my husband. Claire turned toward her. She had always known Pat and George for a lifetime. She had never heard of any man before George. Pat kept her gaze forward, telling the story as if it didn't require the listener's eyes to remain standing. His name was Robert, she said, a firefighter. People called him a hero because he died saving a child in a fire. Claire felt her heart constrict. In that story, the word hero was both noble and cruel because it made the death sound meaningful, while the one left behind saw only a cold bed. The day they told me, Pat continued, I was standing in the kitchen doorway. I was still holding a knife, cutting onions for dinner. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, just like you. Claire lowered her gaze. Her throat trembled. Pat didn't look at her, but Claire felt the words landing precisely on the part of her she kept most carefully hidden. I thought, Pat said slowly, that my life ended there. I believed that if I lived happily again, if I laughed, if I felt lightness in my heart, it would be a betrayal of Robert. Pat turned to look at Claire for the first time since beginning the story. Her eyes weren't soft. They were the eyes of someone who had walked through hell and made it back. I punished myself for a long time, Pat said. I kept the house like a museum. Everything stayed exactly where it had been when he was alive. I refused every inquiry, every attempt to get close. I didn't allow anyone into my life because I believed that love was a box meant to hold only one person. Claire swallowed. She heard herself in every word. Then I met George, Pat continued, her voice a little quieter now, as if this part still brushed against a scar. 2 years later, I hated myself for feeling warmth when I talked to him. I hated myself most for one thing, that I laughed. Claire let out a broken breath. Yes, that was the most frightening part. Not another man, but her own smile, the smile that would summon the question. Then where is Evan in that smile? Pat placed her hand over the back of Claire's hand. This time she held on longer. The grip was a promise. You're not alone. I want you to understand something, Pat said. Loving again doesn't erase having loved. It doesn't make the memories disappear. It doesn't make the one who's gone any smaller. She paused, then continued clearly, as if sealing the words in place. The heart isn't a room with fixed dimensions. It's a house that knows how to expand. Claire looked down at their hands. Pat's face bore the marks of time. Claire was younger, but shaking more. Both were the hands of women who had once tried to hold a life together as it threatened to collapse. But if I love someone else, Claire whispered, her voice thin as mist, I'm afraid I'll forget Evan. Pat shook her head gently. You won't forget. You'll just remember in a different way. The pain won't always stand right at the door. It will move inward, become part of you, a part that no longer demands that you bleed to prove it exists. Claire closed her eyes. Tears spilled over this time without effort, without composure, without fear of being seen. They fell straight down, hot, real, like a rain finally allowed to fall after being held back for 3 years. I'm so tired, Claire burst out between sobs. I don't want to be left again. I don't want to open the door only to have it slammed shut. Pat tightened her grip. I know. Claire cried harder. She cried for Evan, for Daisy, for 3 years of living like someone walking on ice, for the failed dinner, for the humiliation of being left mid-sentence, and for something more frightening than all of it, because she still wanted to live. When the sobs eased, Claire exhaled, her voice raw, as if confessing a secret. I don't want to just exist anymore. Pat didn't say goodbye. She didn't say that's right. She only nodded slowly, like someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear those words. Then, Pat said, her voice low and steady, start by allowing yourself to breathe. A breeze passed through the park, carrying the scent of wet earth and leaves. Claire wiped her face and looked up at the sky. For the first time in a long while, she didn't see only loss. She saw a space large enough for something new to grow. Not as a replacement, not as a betrayal, just a continuation. And in that silence, Claire understood. The pain was real, but life was not over. After the night in the park with Pat, Claire didn't suddenly become better. There was no miracle, no dramatic rebound like in the stories people tell themselves for comfort. There was only a small change, so small that if she hadn't listened closely, she would have missed it. She no longer felt that taking a deep breath was a betrayal. The next morning, Claire walked Daisy to school, watched her daughter run into the building with a backpack nearly half her size, then stood by the school gate longer than usual. Cold wind swept across her face, stinging her eyes. Claire reminded herself, life was still happening, and she was still in it. That evening, after Daisy had fallen asleep, Claire pulled Evan's memory box down from the top of the closet. She had avoided that box for a long time, because it was like a locked room. Opening it hurt, but not opening it felt like losing something. Now, with the memory notebook already holding its first pages, Claire understood something clearly. She couldn't let Evan exist only as a wound. Evan had to be kept as part of the family, in the right place, at the right size. She laid everything out on the dining table, a few photographs, an old concert ticket, a note Evan had once left on the refrigerator, a letter he wrote to her during her finals, and the small bracelet he had bought for Daisy when she had just learned to walk. Each item was a piece of a life, and each piece could cut her if she held it the wrong way. Claire took out a blank album. She didn't choose one with flowers or elaborate decorations, just a simple light gray fabric cover, understated, the way Evan had lived. She pasted in the first photograph. Evan holding newborn Daisy, his eyes red but his mouth smiling, his forehead gently touching his daughter's like an unspoken vow. Under the photo, Claire wrote, your dad was scared, but your dad was happy. Her handwriting trembled at first, then gradually steadied, as if her hand were remembering how to hold important things without letting them fall. She didn't write to create a legend. She wrote ordinary things. Evan liked his coffee weak, always hummed softly while washing dishes, had a habit of touching the back of Claire's neck as he passed by, a quiet signal of, I'm here. She wrote about the small flaws that had once annoyed her, too. Evan often forgot his keys and often draped his jacket over a chair instead of hanging it on the hook. Claire wrote these things because she understood. Daisy needed a real father, not a perfect statue. Daisy discovered the album one weekend evening. She came out into the living room, her hair messy, her eyes sleepy, and saw her mother sitting at the table, warm yellow light pouring down like honey. Daisy stood at the doorway for a moment instead of coming in, as if afraid of breaking the scene. What are you doing, Mom? Daisy asked softly. Claire looked up. She didn't rush to hide anything. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to shield Daisy from memory. She pulled out the chair beside her and patted the cushion. Dad's album, she said, so you can open it whenever you want. Daisy sat down, her eyes fixed on the page. She touched Evan's photograph, her small finger tracing the outline of his face, as if memorizing it. Daisy didn't cry. She just let out a quiet breath. I miss Dad, Daisy said. I do too, Claire replied. They sat like that for a long time, saying very little. In the apartment, memory no longer stole the air from their lungs. It became something that could be placed on the table, looked at together, held without being swallowed by it. A few days later, Claire cleared a small corner of the bookshelf in the living room. Not an altar, no candles, no wilting flowers. Just one photo of Evan, the history book he loved, and a small frame holding a drawing Daisy had made. A stick figure man, a stick figure girl, and an oversized sun. In the corner, Daisy had scribbled, "Dad?" After setting it up, Claire stood there for a while. She felt something inside her finally arranged properly. Evan was there, respected, remembered, but no longer occupying the entire house. Claire no longer worshipped her grief. She honored the love that had existed. And then Claire began to say yes, not by suddenly becoming social or outgoing, just by stopping her retreat. When Daisy's school emailed about a parent meeting, Claire didn't look for an excuse to decline. When Tessa invited her to a small Friday night exhibition, she didn't reflexively say, "I'm tired." When Nora texted, "Come over for lunch," Claire didn't hesitate, as if stepping into Pat's house would break her. She went. She showed up. She sat on folding chairs in the school's multi-purpose room, listening to the teacher talk about Daisy's strengths, how well she wrote, how often she helped other students. Claire watched Daisy stand beside the classroom display of student work, her eyes shining with pride. And Claire realized sometimes moving on isn't about searching for something new. Moving on is about standing still in what already exists without running away. One Thursday afternoon, Daisy's school sent out a notice about a special activity. The class would visit a children's exhibition at the very gallery where Claire worked. A program called Art and Stories. The kids would look at paintings and then write short reflections. Claire read the email, her heart giving a small, sharp ache. Life had a way of placing her inside strange circles. The gallery had once been where she hid from pain. Now it was becoming the place where Daisy stepped into her mother's world. On the day of the event, the gallery was livelier than usual. Children's footsteps, laughter, and voices filled the space, turning its usual solemn quiet into something alive. Claire stood at the desk, keeping gentle order, handing teachers their lists, guiding them through the rooms. Daisy ran over, grabbed her mother's hand for a brief second, then let go to run after her friends. "Mom, stay here, okay?" she said, as if afraid her mother might disappear. "I will," Claire replied. "I'm right here." Among the parents, Claire saw many unfamiliar faces. And then she noticed a man standing near a large painting in the corner, not talking much, just observing. He wore a dark coat, tall, broad-shouldered, but the way he lifted his gaze was calm, almost quiet. Beside him stood a little girl about Daisy's age, her hair neatly tied back, staring intently at a painting as if it were telling her a private story. The girl turned and called softly, "Dad." The man bent down, listened, and gave a small nod. Unhurried, unexaggerated, just present. Daisy ran past, stopped when she saw the girl. "Ella," she exclaimed, like they'd known each other forever. The two children immediately stuck together like matching pieces. Claire blinked. Ella. She had heard Daisy mention this name before. A desk mate, the girl who borrowed pens, the one who liked writing stories, just like Daisy. The man looked up at that moment. His eyes met Claire's. No scrutiny, no excessive curiosity, just a polite, composed look, like someone accustomed to keeping the right distance. He stepped halfway closer, stopping at just the right point. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and clear. "I'm Miles Carter, Ella's father." Claire felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not attraction, but something else. The sense of safety in a meeting that didn't require her to become anyone. She stood straight and replied gently, "Claire Bennett, Daisy's mom, and I work here." Miles nodded, his eyes briefly taking in the gallery before returning to her. "It's beautiful," he said. "It feels like even the air is lighter." Claire paused, surprised by that phrasing. Not everyone spoke about beauty that way. Behind them, Daisy and Ella had already sat down on the floor, heads bent close together, small hands pointing at a painting, whispering like they were planning a secret mission. Claire looked at the scene, and inside her, a quiet, unfamiliar calm opened up. Not loud, not rushed. Just like a new door being added to her house, not yet opened, but already there. And she realized this could be the beginning of something. Very slow. After the Art and Stories event at the gallery, Claire thought meeting Miles Carter would amount to nothing more than a polite handshake, a brief crossing of parental orbits before everyone returned to their own. Her life had grown accustomed to that rhythm, encounters that left no trace, greetings that never turned into anything else. But Daisy and Ella did not live by the rule of everyone back to their own orbit. They clicked together like two matching pieces. The first time Claire heard Daisy talk about Ella, with that sudden brightness in her voice, she recognized something rare in it: joy without effort. Ella seemed to feel the same, and children in their natural way pull adults closer the way they pull chairs together to fit a table. A week later, Daisy came home with a notice. The class was organizing a reading picnic at the park on Friday afternoon. Parents were invited to come with their children, each child bringing a favorite book. Claire read the paper, thought about asking to leave the gallery early, then thought about the empty space on a park bench if she showed up alone. The familiar hesitation stirred, but Daisy looked up at her, eyes clear. "Can you come, Mom?" she asked, as if this mattered as much as a test. Claire nodded. "I'll come." Friday afternoon brought wind and pale sunlight. The grass was damp with mist. Blankets were spread out in scattered patches of color. Children ran in circles, laughing and calling to one another like small bells. Claire sat down on a blanket near the edge. Daisy set her book on her lap and leaned against her mother, an old habit quietly returning. Then Daisy jumped up when she spotted Ella. "Mom, I'm going over there," Daisy said quickly, already running off before Claire could remind her not to run too fast. Claire watched her daughter sit down beside a neatly ponytailed girl, and right after that, a tall figure standing nearby with a water bottle and a paper bag in hand approached slowly, as if careful not to startle anyone. Miles Carter. He didn't step straight into Claire's space. He stopped at a distance that was polite, a distance that still left Claire the choice. "Hi, Claire," he said, his voice low, unforced, unadorned. "Good to see you again." Claire nodded. "Hi, Miles." He looked down at the two girls. Daisy and Ella were bent over the book as if sharing a secret. Miles smiled faintly, said nothing more, and sat down at the opposite edge of the blanket, not too close, not too far. A gentle quiet settled between them. Not the awkward silence of people who don't know what to say, but the kind shared by two people who understand that not every space needs to be filled with words. Claire noticed that Miles rarely checked his phone. He watched his daughter, not tensely, not with control, just present, a steadiness of presence that made the person beside him instinctively loosen. "Ella talks a lot about Daisy," Miles said after a while, as if opening a small door. "She says Daisy writes great stories." Claire glanced at her daughter. Daisy was pointing to a line of text, her lips moving as she read. "Daisy talks about Ella, too," she replied. "The two of them, it's like they've found someone who speaks the same language." Miles nodded as if he understood how much that meant to children and to mothers who had once feared their child might be lonely. They didn't talk much. They let the pale sunlight drift by, let the sound of children running around form the backdrop. Claire realized she didn't have to perform around Miles. She didn't have to smile at the right moments to prove she was okay. She didn't have to tell stories to fill the gaps. She could just sit, watch her child, breathe. A child ran past and knocked over a water bottle. Claire startled, instinctively starting to move. Miles had already bent down, set the bottle upright, and wiped it quickly with a paper towel he'd brought. He did it neatly without waiting for thanks. "You come prepared," Claire said, the words slipping out without intention. Miles glanced at the paper towel in his hand, then at Claire. "After a while, you learn to prepare for things that might spill," he said. The sentence landed lightly, but Claire heard it like a crack opening. After a while. Not after a month. Not after a fresh wound. After years of living alongside loss. Claire didn't ask, but Miles continued, his voice calm, as if he had no desire to turn pain into a performance. "My wife passed away 4 years ago," he said. "Cancer. Ella was 4. Claire held her breath. She watched his face, waiting for his eyes to change. But Miles only looked toward his daughter, like someone who kept his grief where it belonged, in his life, not in other people's mouths. "I'm sorry," Claire said. Miles nodded. "I am too." A simple answer, no elaboration, no extension. And that simplicity eased something in Claire's chest. She understood. Miles wasn't telling her to be pitied. He was telling her so she'd know he understood what it meant to lose and what it meant to stand up while still carrying the tear. The picnic ended. On the way home, Daisy tugged at Claire's hand, eyes bright. Mom, can Ella and I have a play date next week? Claire paused. A play date? Daisy nodded as if this decision had already been approved by the highest authority of 8-year-olds. Ella said her dad said yes too. Claire turned and saw Miles a few yards away, helping Ella with her bag. He looked up as if sensing Claire's gaze, then walked over, not rushed, not pressing. If you're comfortable, Miles said, we could have Daisy come over one weekend afternoon, or Ella could come to your place, whatever works for you. There was care in his voice, not care born of fear of rejection, but care rooted in respect for boundaries. Claire looked at him, then at Daisy. She saw her daughter waiting, both hands clenched. Okay, Claire said, Sunday afternoon. Sunday came, and Ella visited Claire's apartment. The girls spread books and paper across the living room floor, writing stories, drawing illustrations, giggling, sometimes arguing over character names, and then making up just as quickly. Claire made hot cocoa, listened to the sounds of children, and realized her apartment hadn't held this kind of noise in a long time. Miles came to pick up his daughter in near evening. He stood at the doorway, not stepping in too far, keeping courtesy even now that things felt a little closer. Claire walked Ella out. Daisy followed, hugged her friend, then stepped back. Thank you, Miles said. No problem, Claire replied. She hesitated for a second, then added almost casually, Evan, my husband, used to like afternoons like this too. He'd sit on the floor with Daisy, spread out the paper, and pretend he didn't know how to draw so Daisy could teach him. Evan's name left Claire's mouth like a test. She was used to people stiffening, their expressions shifting, becoming awkward. She was used to apologizing for mentioning him. But Miles didn't flinch. He simply nodded slowly. He sounds like a very good father, he said. Daisy was lucky to have him. Claire felt warmth rise in her throat, not from sadness, but from being acknowledged, from being allowed to speak Evan's name without apologizing, without hiding, without cutting herself off mid-sentence. Miles looked at her, his gaze steady. If there's ever a time you want to tell me more about Evan, he said, you can. I understand. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't flirtation. It felt like a door opened just wide enough, allowing Claire to set her memories down without fear of being pushed away. When Miles left, Claire closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment. Inside, Daisy was laughing over a story she had just finished writing. Outside, Miles's car disappeared down the street. Claire walked back into the living room, looked at her daughter, at the papers scattered across the floor, at the shelf corner holding Evan's photo, and for the first time, she realized something both small and immense. Besides Miles, she could breathe. Not because the pain had vanished, but because the pain no longer forced her to hold her breath just to exist. After the first play date, nothing changed all at once. There was no lightning strike, no feeling of crossing a line, and suddenly, life brightened. It was just that, from a very small corner of Claire's calendar, Miles began to appear as something natural, without pushing doors open, without taking up space. Some mornings when Claire dropped Daisy off at school, she would see Miles standing by the gate with Ella. He always carried whatever Ella had forgotten, a jacket, a water bottle, sometimes a hair clip. He greeted Claire with a nod, just enough. Claire returned it the same way, not too familiar, not distant, a light kind of knowing that didn't require her to tense up. Then came the school book fair. Daisy and Ella were in charge of the book table, taping little handwritten cards onto the covers. This one is sad but beautiful. This one made me cry. This one has dragons. Claire stood nearby, neatly stacking books. Miles stood across from her, handing her extra tape and straightening a crooked sign. Neither of them said much, but they worked together as if it were already familiar. At the end of term performance, Daisy stood on stage, singing slightly off-key but with eyes shining bright. Claire watched her, heart racing. When Daisy glanced down to find her mother, her gaze paused for a beat. Not just on Claire, but on Miles beside her, as if knowing they were both there made her steadier. After the performance, the crowd was loud and chaotic. Claire stepped aside to avoid small talk. Miles approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Daisy sang well," he said. Claire nodded. "She was nervous, but she tried." Miles looked at her a moment longer. "You did too," he said quietly. "You're still trying." It wasn't a compliment, it was recognition. And Claire realized it had been a long time since anyone had seen the trying in her. People only saw the results. She worked, she raised her child, she didn't fall apart in public. One rainy afternoon, Claire stopped by the cafe near the school, while Daisy was at an after-school class. The place was small, the windows fogged, the air thick with espresso. She took a corner table and opened her laptop. The door swung open, cold air rushed in, and Miles walked in with an umbrella still dripping. He spotted Claire and paused for half a second, asking with his eyes. Claire nodded. They sat across from each other, each with a hot drink. They talked just enough. Work, small things from the week, a book Miles was reading. Claire noticed she didn't have to perform being okay. The silence between them didn't scare her. It felt comfortable, like a room with windows. And then Claire had a day when she broke. Not dramatically. Just one evening, when she opened the closet and saw Evan's coat still hanging there. The old fabric smell pulled memory out like a blade. Claire stood there for a long time, then sank down onto the floor, her back against the closet door, her chest tightening. Guilt flooded in. Guilt for drinking coffee with Miles and feeling lighter. Guilt for laughing. Guilt because part of her had started wanting days that were more than just surviving. Her phone vibrated. A message from Miles. "I'm near the school. Daisy and Ella just got out. Do you need me to bring Daisy home?" Claire stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back, "Thank you. Please help me today." About 40 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Daisy ran in first, talking nonstop about class. Miles stood at the threshold, not stepping inside, still respecting the house and the unspoken things it held. "Daisy's fine," he said. Then his gaze rested on Claire. "Today, looks like it was a hard day." Claire was about to deny it, but in the end she just nodded. Miles didn't ask for details. He didn't say everything will be okay. He only said one thing, very gently. "You don't have to be okay right now, and you don't have to explain." The words tightened Claire's throat. For the first time, she felt allowed to be weak without feeling ashamed. Miles nodded goodbye and left, without leaving pressure behind. Only the sense that someone understood without demanding anything. A few days later, while Daisy and Ella attended their reading club in the library, Claire stood in the hallway looking through the glass. Miles stood beside her, sharing the same cool draft. He turned to her. This time he said her name, without the formality he'd used before. "Claire," Miles said, "if you feel comfortable, may I take you out to dinner? Just the two of us." Claire looked at him. There was no urgency in his eyes, only the patience of someone who knew that precious things take time. She exhaled. "Okay," Claire said, her voice quiet but steady. "I will." And for the first time in a long while, Claire did not close the door that was opening in front of her. The first dinner that was just the two of them didn't resemble the dates Claire had imagined over the past 3 years. There was no youthful nervousness, no probing questions like, "What do you want from me?" Just a small restaurant, warm yellow light, background music, thin as breath. And a strange sensation. Claire didn't have to prove who she was. Miles arrived on time. He stood when Claire walked in, pulled out her chair, and said simply, "You're here," as if her presence was something he valued, not something he took for granted. They talked about easy things. Work, the kids, a book Ella was reading, and Daisy was arguing with the whole world about because of the ending. Miles smiled lightly as he spoke, his eyes warm but unshowy. Claire found herself smiling too, without effort, and immediately a familiar blade slid through her chest. "You're happy without Evan." She set her glass down, fingers tightening around the rim. Miles noticed the shift but didn't ask right away. He simply slowed down, allowing the space to exist without forcing Claire to fill it. After a moment, Claire spoke. No more circling, because she knew that if she kept going as if nothing were wrong, she would pull herself under. "Miles," she began, her voice rough. "I'm scared." Miles looked at her calmly. "Of what?" Claire swallowed. The words inside her felt tangled together. Hard to separate, hard to say aloud, because saying them meant admitting they were real. "I'm afraid," Claire said slowly, "that if I take one more step, I'll forget Evan." Saying it felt like touching something sacred. She waited for Miles to grow awkward, or change the subject, or offer some generic reassurance. But he did none of those things. He simply nodded once, very slightly as if to say, "I understand." Claire continued, her breath unsteady. "I'm afraid Daisy will be hurt. I'm afraid she'll think I'm replacing her dad. I'm afraid of how people will look at me and judge." She let out a small laugh, joyless. "I'm afraid they'll say, 'It hasn't even been that long,' or 'She didn't really love her husband.' I'm afraid of everything." Miles was quiet for a moment. His silence didn't press down on Claire. It was like a blanket laid over a wound so she could keep speaking without the sting of air. "Miles," Claire said, almost a whisper, "I don't want to betray him." Miles placed his hand on the table, not touching Claire's hand, just close enough for her to know he was fully present in this conversation. "Claire," he said, his voice low and steady, "I didn't come here to replace Evan." He said Evan's name clearly, without avoiding it, without fear. That alone made Claire's eyes burn. "I'm not competing with someone who's gone," Miles continued. "I don't want, and I don't have the right, to take his place in your life or in Daisy's. Evan will always be part of your family." Claire looked at him, searching for a crack of insincerity. But Miles wasn't trying to be admirable. He was simply being honest. "I'm only asking," Miles paused, choosing his words carefully, "for a place in the present, just a small one, enough for me to stand beside you if you allow it." The words didn't make Claire fearless, but they made the fear less toxic, because they put the boundary in the right place. A new love wasn't a takeover. It was a request to coexist. Claire exhaled, her eyes stinging. She nodded very slightly. Dinner ended with a softened quiet, not because everything had been resolved, but because, for the first time, Claire felt that her pain could sit at the table alongside a new possibility, without anyone forcing her to choose between them. But the real test came afterward, the way life always prefers it, quietly, ordinarily. The next afternoon, Claire went to pick up Daisy at Pat's house. Nora was in the kitchen. Pat was folding towels. Daisy sat on the rug, absorbed in a paper model for class, a small castle with pointed towers and windows cut out with scissors. Miles came to pick up Ella, since the girls had just had a play date. He stood in the living room, car keys in hand, watching Ella retie her shoelaces. Pat's house always carried a warm scent: tea, baked goods, and the feeling that family is still here. Daisy struggled with her scissors, her face tightening. One strip of paper slipped, the castle window tearing along one edge. She jumped to her feet, eyes reddening with frustration. "I ruined it," Daisy said, her voice choking. Not because of the castle, but because she always wanted to do things right, as if doing them right might keep life from breaking again. Claire stepped forward, about to sit down and help, but her hands were full with bags, her mind still tired, and for a moment she was slower than usual. Miles had already knelt down. He didn't take over. He simply lowered himself to Daisy's eye level, looked at the model for a beat, then asked gently, "Do you want to fix this window?" Daisy blinked, looked at him, and hesitated. Then she handed him the castle, an instinctive decision. Miles took a new piece of paper and carefully cut another window, slow and precise, as if he were repairing something more important than a craft. He handed it to Daisy and pointed. "Glue it here. Cover the tear, like a window frame." Daisy followed his instructions. The window became square again, not perfectly flawless, but steady. "Wow," Daisy breathed, her eyes lighting up. "You're really good." Miles smiled. "I'm not good. You just didn't give up." Claire stood beside them, her heart tightening. Part of her hurt because Evan should have been here, sitting on the floor, helping Daisy cut paper, laughing when she glued it crooked. Another part of her felt so deeply grateful she almost cried, because in this room, Daisy still had a man who knelt down to her level, who didn't make her feel like a burden, who didn't make her feel alone. Daisy turned to Claire, as if suddenly remembering something important. "Mom, Uncle Miles helped me." Claire nodded, her throat tight. She looked at Miles. He wasn't looking to Claire for approval. He simply stood, brushing paper scraps from his hands, as if helping a child fix a paper window were the most natural thing in the world. The moment wasn't dramatic, but it opened something inside Claire, a door she had kept locked with fear for 3 years. She understood as clearly as the yellow light in Pat's kitchen. A new love doesn't destroy old memories. It doesn't erase Evan. It doesn't make him smaller. It simply opens another door so light can enter a house where Claire had lived in the dark for far too long. Happiness did not return like a storm. It didn't crash in, didn't shatter everything to prove its strength. It came back like a new habit, small, steady, and durable. A mug of hot cocoa placed in the right spot on a winter evening, a pair of children's shoes is lined up neatly by the door, a text that said, "Did you get there yet?" Not to control, but simply to make sure the other person was still here. Claire didn't wake up one morning and discover that she was no longer in pain. Evan still existed like a stitch buried deep beneath the skin. It no longer bled, but she could always feel it when the weather changed. The difference was that she was no longer afraid of that stitch. She had begun to understand that pain was not the enemy. Pain was simply proof that a love had once been real. Miles never asked Claire to forget. He never asked her to seal Evan away in a box, so moving forward would be easier. He lived with that truth as part of the house they were building, and because of that, Claire gradually stopped fighting herself. Some evenings, Daisy and Ella sprawled out on the living room rug, writing stories and arguing over character names. Claire stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, listening to the girls' laughter echo through the apartment, and suddenly realized it had been a long time since the space had sounded like this. Not because Evan had been erased, but because Claire had stopped treating silence as a punishment. And then, on an ordinary evening, so ordinary that no one had prepared their emotions, Miles arrived at Claire's place earlier than usual. Outside, the air was damp and cold. The windows were veiled with a thin layer of fog. In the kitchen, warm yellow light poured onto the table like honey, the kind of light Claire had once believed was gone from her life forever. She was chopping vegetables. Daisy sat on a high stool, recounting her day at school with serious enthusiasm. Ella had spread drawing paper across the table, determined to draw a dragon that was supposed to be terrifying but looked more like a stuffed animal. Miles leaned against the doorway, sleeves rolled up, watching the scene as if it were something rare. "Want help?" Claire asked without looking up. Miles stepped in, grabbed a towel, dried his hands like a small ritual, and started chopping onions. He worked neatly, unhurriedly, without turning the kitchen into a stage. They cooked side by side like two people already used to standing together without needing many words. When Daisy hopped off the stool and pulled Ella into the living room to keep writing the story, the kitchen was left with only the sound of the knife against the cutting board and the soft bubbling of boiling water. Miles set the knife down. "Claire!" He said her name, the name that no longer startled her, only made her still. She turned. "What is it?" Miles didn't rush. He looked at her for a moment, as if making sure what he was about to say wouldn't frighten her, wouldn't make her run. "I've thought about this for a long time," Miles said. "Not about what I want, but about what you need." Claire's throat went dry, but she didn't retreat. She stood there, both hands resting on the counter, ready to hear the truth. Miles stepped closer, still keeping just enough distance that she could step back if she needed to, but Claire didn't. "I know you will always love Evan," Miles said, his voice low and steady. "And I respect that. I don't want to replace him. I don't want to make anyone disappear." Claire felt her eyes burn, not from sadness, but from finally being placed correctly inside her own story. Miles took a breath, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a box that felt like an everyday sentence. He didn't kneel right away. He simply placed the box on the counter and opened it. Inside was a simple ring, its small metallic glow catching the yellow light. I'm not asking you to forget the past, Miles said. I'm only asking to be your present, if you'll allow me. Claire looked at the ring, then at Miles. In a single heartbeat, she saw everything again. Evan in the bookstore. Evan is holding Daisy. Evan is leaving to buy bread. She saw Pat gripping her hand at the funeral. She heard Daisy ask, "Is Mom allowed to be happy again?" She saw herself sitting on the bedroom floor, convinced she would never stand up again, and she understood. If Evan were still here, he would not want her heart to become a locked room. Claire reached out and touched the ring box. Her hand didn't shake the way it had when she'd chosen a dress for a first date. It trembled slightly, but it was the tremor of someone stepping through a doorway, fully aware that she was still alive. "I say yes," Claire said, her voice soft but clear. "I say yes, if you promise me one thing." Miles met her gaze. "What is it?" Claire swallowed. "Evan will always be spoken of, not like a ghost, but as part of Daisy, part of me." Miles nodded immediately without hesitation. "I promise." When Daisy and Ella ran into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of food, Claire had already wiped away her tears, but Daisy noticed anyway. She looked at the ring box, then at her mother's face, then at Miles, and instead of asking why, the way adults expect, Daisy walked closer with a calm that felt far older than her age. "So, I get to hold the rings at the wedding, right?" Daisy asked, her voice very serious. Claire laughed, a real laugh, unplanned, unrestrained. "Yes," she said, pulling Daisy into her arms. "You'll be the one to hold the rings." The wedding was small, just like the way they lived. No noise, no drama. A gentle morning, sunlight soft enough that no one had to squint. Pat, George, and Nora sat in the front row, eyes red, mouths smiling. Daisy walked forward with the ring box in her hands, shoulders straight, carrying something very important. And it was important. In Pat's kitchen after the ceremony, Claire placed two photographs side by side on the shelf. One of Evan holding Daisy on the day she was born, and a new one. Claire, Miles, Daisy, and Ella standing together, smiling under seaside sunlight. The two photos didn't clash. They simply told a larger truth. A life can have many chapters, and no chapter cancels out another. That night when the house was quiet, Claire stood before the shelf, touched the corner of Evan's frame lightly, then turned to Miles. He didn't ask anything. He simply took her hand and squeezed gently a presence that didn't demand explanation. Claire rested her head against Miles's shoulder and finally understood what Pat had said long ago, what she was only now truly able to believe. A heart doesn't replace people. A heart only learns how to grow larger so it can hold both the past and the future.